Garrote. A bloodthirsty crowd gathered in the city square, in order to rejoice, watching how the next heretic will be burned at the stake. Why in the morning, from all sides, brushwood and firewood were tightened and linked around a high pillar. After everything was ready for the execution, and the executed was tied to the pillar, the brushwood was set on fire, and as soon as the first flames began to lick their feet, the execution passed through two scenarios. In the first version, the sentenced to death began to scream, and in this screaming was heard repentance in the deed, which often caused compassion in the crowd of the crowd. But the second option is more interesting, when the freedom or heretic shouted in support of his point of view, even before his death, without betraying his principles, and his courage, bringing the crowd to admiration, immersing the individuals present in thought, and the fiery execution itself, into something similar to the concert of the Rammstein group. Needless to say, the authorities did not like such a reaction of the crowd, neither in the first nor in its second version. It was for this reason that the suicide bombers, before the execution of the executioners, began to strangle slightly with a leather belt or simply a suitable piece of rope in order to burn already in an unconscious state. Why the noose was thrown around the neck and tied behind the pillar. Based on this experience, and the device was invented, for torture and execution of which, today will be discussed. Garrote is a sharp Spanish word in translation, how to tighten, tighten. The King of Spain Ferdinand VII was impressed with the effectiveness of garrote and made it the main way to execute criminals in 1828. In addition to Spain, garrote was widespread in the Philippines, in Portugal. Before the invention of an electric chair, garrote was sometimes used in the USA, in Puerto Rico, Cuba. During the Pyrenees War, the French used garrote to execute the Spanish partisans. Murder technology. It is worth starting with the method of delivery of a suicide bomber to the place of execution, which also made some adjustments to the execution process itself. And when the garrote execution of these methods is 3. 1. Noble garrote, the privilege of the highest layers of society. The suicide bomber came to the place of execution in the saddle, on a horse, and he himself gave the command to the executioner by the beginning of the execution. In turn, the executioner did everything possible so that this procedure was as painless and fleeting as possible. 2. Ordinary garrote, the most common. The suicide bomber came on a mule or a horse. And he could also count on a quick and in some way humane death. 3. The vile garrote. She was executed by the notorious criminals, terrorists, heretics, and other gonics. The suicide bomber came to the place of execution on a donkey or walked. The executioner did everything so that death was painful and prolonged. By its device and the method of killing, garrote can be divided into 2 types. Classic. The method of killing is strangulation. Initially, garrote was a column with 2 holes. The executed was put with his back to the pillar, torn into the holes a rope, which the executioner was tightened with a tight knot from behind. Later, the rope began to be twisted with a stick. This method has gained particular popularity during the executions of the sectarians of Albanians. With the improvement, a small bench appeared, and the stand, which made it possible to transport Garrote from one place of execution to another. But the main improvement is a steel hoop that is driven by a screw with a gate. The whole process was simplified. The suicide bomber sits on the bench, a hoop closes on his neck, the executioner makes 3 or 4 turns the gate, and that's all. Sometimes a load was hung at the end of the gate, which the screw squeezed with its weight. During strangulation, a large amount of carbon dioxide accumulates in the brain of executed, which causes strong sexual excitement, erection, and subsequent ejaculation in men, an abundant allocation of vaginal secretion in women. In order not to forget that this is the murder weapon, and not the BDSM sex toy, it is worth mentioning other signs of strangulation: a blue face, abundant salivation, and most importantly, the eyeballs who came out of the orbit. Therefore, the executed often put on a bag on his head, so as not to shock those present by dying agony. Catalan Garrote. The method of murder is a strangulation, a fracture of the cervical vertebrae. The Catalan Garrote has become most widespread. Constructive differences from the classic Garrote: a motionless hoop, and a screw that passed through a pillar, and had a tip at the end. The executioner twisted the screw, which stuck executed into the neck, forcing him to squeeze his throat into the hoop, and thereby strangle himself. If the executioner twisted the screw quickly, then death came from the cervical vertebrae broken by the tip. The execution on the Catalan Garrote was faster, and was considered less painful, with the fracture of the vertebrae. But there were cases when the tip did not fall into the cervical vertebrae, but a little to the side, in which case a long and painful death is guaranteed. In the late samples, Garrote, instead of a sprout on a screw, often used a blade, or a metal rose, which still accelerated the execution. And Garrote herself was sometimes in the form of a chair. With the help of Garrote were executed Emperor Inca Atailipa, Mariana de Pineda Munoz, anarchists Francisco Granado and Joaquin Delgado on August 18, 1963. The last execution with the help of a Garrote in Spain, anarchist Salvador Puig Antic, March 2, 1974. In Andorra, the execution through Garrote was structural until 1990. Although it has not been used since the beginning of the 20th century. Garrote, favorite device for execution of traitors at the Spanish Mafia. According to some reports, it may be used by its members in our time.